Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question comes to us from the True Stories collection, as in, it actually happened at an event I was actually judging. Amy attacks unblocked with an Ocelot Pride, then says, pass turn. Nick then says that he's going to play a Thought Scour. While Nick is resolving that spell, Amy says, oh yeah, I get a cat token. Nick calls for a judge and says that Amy missed this trigger. What's the correct ruling? Okay, so based on the facts presented in the problem statement, I think it's pretty obvious that Amy forgot about her Ocelot Pride trigger. On the other hand, there's no such infraction as forgotten trigger. The thing we actually have is called missed trigger. And there is a difference. To see what I mean, let's consider probably the most well-known application of this concept, which involves the prowess mechanic. If you've been a fan of the channel for a while now, you might remember that officially, you generally don't have to announce the prowess trigger until the creature is actually dealing damage. So let's say you played a sorcery, but forgot about the fact that it would buff your prowess creature. Then you attacked with that creature, your opponent blocked, and you didn't remember about prowess until it was actually time to deal combat damage. Well, guess what? You forgot your trigger, but because you remembered it in time, you still get it. So let's apply that same logic to the situation presented in the original problem statement. Amy forgot her trigger, but did she remember it in time to get it? For the answer to that, let's consult with the IPG, which tells us that different types of triggered abilities have different bars for when the trigger's controller must acknowledge them. The general philosophy for all of them is the same. Triggered abilities are assumed to be remembered until both players have progressed the game state to a point that conclusively demonstrates otherwise. So, for the specific triggered ability from the original problem statement, that falls under the category of a triggered ability that causes a change in the visible game state when it resolves. In this case, creating a token. And as we can see, that means that Amy must demonstrate awareness of that ability before taking any game action that could only be taken after that ability had resolved. And we can see that passing priority and even casting instant speed spells are explicitly called out as not being sufficient to call such triggers missed, since it is legal to do these things with a triggered ability on the stack. So with that, it becomes extremely important to know when exactly Nick performed his game actions. It would be legal for him to cast Thought Scour in response to the Ocelot Pride's ability, but it would also be legal for him to wait until that ability resolves and then cast his spell. There was no communication from the players regarding when specifically Nick was casting the spell, but fortunately there is a defined tournament shortcut that covers exactly this case. After a phrase like pass turn, if Nick takes any game actions, these are assumed to be taking place in Amy's end of turn step. From context, we can see that Nick is assumed to be acting in response to any triggered abilities that may have triggered during that step. And so with that being the case, Amy has indeed remembered the Ocelot Pride trigger in time and should get the cast token. If you notice, there was an interesting line at the end of that rule that was on screen just now. It specifically referenced triggered abilities that do not target. Although they're not specifically called out as such, modal triggered abilities would be treated the same as targeted ones. Why is there a call out for some triggered abilities to be treated differently? It's because triggered abilities that require targets, modes, or other choices as part of the process of putting them onto the stack belong to a different class according to the missed trigger policy. For example, this Needletooth pack has an ability that triggers at the beginning of the end step, and its resolution affects the visible game state. But it also requires its controller to choose a target as that ability is put onto the stack. Therefore, Needletooth Pack's ability affects the visible game state at an earlier time than Ocelot Pride's. Amy would need to announce her choice of the target for Needletooth Pack's ability before passing priority with that ability on the stack. In concrete terms, because saying pass turn indicates your opponent is free to act during your end step, I would rule Needletooth Pack's ability missed unless Amy mentioned it as part of the same sentence as she passed the turn. In the actual scenario this question is based on, Nick actually took multiple game actions during Amy's end step, including activating a Ghost Vacuum and fetching for a Surveil land and surveilling into his graveyard. This changes absolutely nothing about what the correct answer to the scenario is. All of Nick's actions could legally be taken with Amy's Ocelot Pride trigger still on the stack. So that's the assumption the judge should make, absent any communication to the contrary. Now, speaking of the actual scenario where I made this ruling, Nick was predictably disappointed in the outcome. In fact, after the match, we even had a conversation about it. One of the things that he asked me was whether he could have done something that would have resulted in his preferred outcome of Amy not getting the cat token. Well, I've got some bad news for Nick, which is that it doesn't really work like that. The general philosophy is that players cannot cause triggered abilities their opponents control to become missed by taking game actions or otherwise unilaterally advancing the game state. This is sort of like how you cannot scam your opponent out of an abhorrent Oculus manifest by drawing quickly after you untap. You would need to somehow get the abhorrent Oculus player to agree to moving past the upkeep. If you draw for the turn and your opponent points out that before that happens there actually is a triggered ability that triggered during the upkeep, well, they would still get it even if they had forgotten about the abhorrent Oculus up until that point. Now, likewise, it doesn't matter if Amy had previously forgotten about her Ocelot Pride trigger. If she remembers it by the time that the policy documents specify, she gets it. Amy had clearly forgotten her triggered ability at the time she passed turn. If Nick had begun his own turn at that point, then that would have closed the window for Amy to remember her trigger. By taking other game actions of his own, though, Nick left that window open. Since Nick has multiple game actions that he wants to take during Amy's end step, one of which takes a fair amount of time to physically execute, his best bet to get his desired outcome would be to somehow trick Amy into saying that there was nothing on the stack when he takes one of those game actions of his. Maybe he could try asking something like, "Is the stack empty?" Longtime viewers might have noticed that this scenario has a certain resemblance to a similar scenario I covered a few years ago involving the casting of Consider into an opponent's Shieldred. Both scenarios also share a lot of common features in their outcomes. I think it's pretty interesting to observe that most of the time when I produce a video about a scenario involving Magic's missed trigger policy, most of the comments tend to be in support of the player getting that triggered ability. See, for example, my videos titled How to Rules Lawyer Your Opponent, or The One Ring versus Sun Cleanser. On the other hand, my video with Shieldred and Consider seem to have a lot of comments arguing the opposite. I'm not sure if this has to do with how I framed the questions in the video, or the personal reputations of the players involved, or other circumstances surrounding the call that the video was based on, or maybe some other factor related to a perceived difference in those triggered abilities that players think might merit a difference in how they're treated. In any case, I'm excited to see what the sentiment is this time around, and whether or not the hive mind thinks that the triggered ability in this scenario should be allowed. I originally was going to grade this video at 3 stars, but I added an extra one because the correct answer surprised a lot of people I shared this scenario with, both players and other judges, some of whom are quite experienced. At first, I thought it would be relatively uncontroversial, but after seeing how many people had doubts about who was in the right, I think it's fair to say that this question is more difficult than I originally thought it would be at first glance, even though the policy surrounding it is pretty crystal clear. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another Daily Ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.